Okay, let's say you only have $40, maybe 45 because of taxes and shit left in your bank account. And again, this is the last of your funds, but you wanted a game to play. But you only have two options. Either get the Lies of P DLC since you already own the base game, or get Elden Ring Nightreign since you've been hearing a lot of good stuff about it. So, which one do you choose? Well, hopefully you chose to save your fucking money, since it's literally the last of your bread. But in all seriousness, if you do have money to spare, which is the best option? A game that was built using the frame of Elden Ring but carved into a more fast-paced multiplayer focused game, where your objective is to zoom around the map with your friends, like crackheads, defeat enemies and bosses as quickly as possible, and defeat all the 8 Night Lords, or the one that adds on to the original game, introducing you to new areas, adding new difficult enemies and bosses for you to face, some really cool new features, and building on the already magnificent but twisted story of the base game. So if you can't decide on which one to get, don't worry, in this video I'll go over each of the games, talking about all the good and bad in order to help narrow down your decision. I'm gonna go over stuff like level design, gameplay / combat, bosses, story, and replay value. And without wasting any more of your time, let's start with the gameplay. If you already played Elden Ring, then you know what Nightreign is gonna feel like for the most part. However, despite the similarities in gameplay and combat, there are some differences. For one, the speed of your character in Nightreign is much faster than Elden Ring, mostly when you're using Surge Sprint or certain classes like Duchess or Wilder. Your primary goal is to kill enemies and bosses as quickly as possible and level up before the night ends. Each character also comes with different skills and abilities. The first skill is the one that refills the fastest and it's mostly used for other stuff other than pure damage. Like Wilder, for example, can use a grappling hook to bring himself closer to an enemy or an enemy closer to him. While these are great, they're not going to do crazy amounts of damage, unless you're a really skilled Duchess, for example. But the ultimate arts, on the other hand, can definitely do some hefty damage. Wilder does this charge close range cannon attack that absolutely crushes most bosses. Iron Eye pulls out a great bow that can erase crowds of enemies in an instant. Executor turns into a giant wolf-like creature. So yeah, these are the ones that can change the outcome of any fight. But other than skills, what's new to the combat? I mean, that's it. Again, the game is just a faster Elden Ring, which I know definitely sold some people already, and me personally, I really liked it. But if you wanted something drastically different from Elden Ring, then you may or may not enjoy this as much, even though some of the characters play a bit differently. For example, Iron Eye is mostly just focused on range and arrows, and I know you had arrows in the other game, but it works way faster here, and it actually feels like a deadly weapon and not a tickle machine. Executor in his normal mode plays very similarly, however when he changes his stance, you can now deflect a lot of attacks like Sekiro, but at the cost of having slower mobility and doing less damage. But it's still fun to pull out against swordsman bosses like Morgott, Bell-Bearing Hunter, and it's even great for annoying ones like Royal Revenant. Duchess can feel a bit differently than the Tarnished, mostly because she has the best dodge in the game, as it can flow continuously, allowing her to do flips and shit. But again, apart from those things, the combat is gonna roughly feel the same, but with some cool new features. Now with Lies of P Overture, I'm assuming you pretty much know how the base game feels already. You know, you got different weapons where you can attach different handles, the combat takes a bit of an inspiration from Bloodborne and Sekiro, except on a much slower pace, you know, stuff like that. The DLC pretty much is obviously the same, but man, what I didn't remember is how slow the combat was. It definitely took me some time to get used to it again, especially coming from Nightreign, where your character moves at Mach speed. Still though, after getting accustomed to the combat, it became really fun again. Parrying certain bosses felt satisfying, the Legion arms are pretty sick, especially the new ones, and the new weapons were surprisingly decent. My two personal favorites are the Pale Knight, which is basically a greatsword that can be used as a shotgun. The moveset for this is fantastic, and the other is a curved sword you get pretty late in the DLC. But apart from that, there's not much to talk about. So in terms of gameplay and combat, they're both pretty good. But if you prefer something really fast paced in terms of overall movement, then Nightreign is for you. But if you want something more calculated where you have to learn the boss's moveset to a T and having more weapon customization options, then you'll love Lies of P Overture. Now let's talk about level design, and let's start with Nightreign. It's hard to call this level design as it's a roguelike game and the levels, or in better words the sessions, changes randomly. But the most I can do is just go over how the game works. You see, in Nightreign, you and 2 other people drop into an open field area. That's randomized. You have 3 days to complete the session, with days 1 and 2 being 15 minutes long, and every 5 minutes the rain closes on you, which is basically the storm from Fortnite. and at the very end of the day you have to face a strong boss. These are usually random. So during the days it's best to maximize as much as possible, grabbing flask upgrades, killing enemies and bosses to level up, so that by day 3 you're fully prepared for the Night Lord. And that's it. Some people may find this a bit repetitive, and I can kind of see why, but for me personally, it wasn't something that bothered me too much, cause there's lots of fun to be had here. The movement is super fast and smooth, so getting from one point of interest to another doesn't feel like a drag. Overworld bosses feel balanced, at least for multiplayer. I know solo is a bit different, and again the Night Lords are super fun to fight as they feel like raid bosses. But despite me liking the gameplay loop, I still have some complaints. One, I do wish there were more areas, and no, I'm not talking about the shifting world events, which are basically when the map randomly has a different area in it, like a lava one, snowfield mountaintop, and an eternal city. I'm talking about the game should have more areas other than Limveiled, because zooming around Limveiled, while fun, does kinda get stale from time to time. And I think adding alternate versions of Caelid, Shadow Altus, stuff like that, would make the game feel a bit more whole. With Lies of P Overture, the level design is pretty much the same linear style like in the base game, but for some reason I personally didn't enjoy too much of the levels that was offered here, mostly the ones after the second boss. The first level was pretty cool, the enemies were a bit annoying, but visually it looked cool. I like the whole snowy area thing going on with the zoo and different creatures. The area with the big booty robot puppets was kind of okay I guess, and I did like the carnival a little, but was kind of bummed out on how short this part was. And everything after that didn't really catch my eye too much until the ending levels. And again, the game is a bit on the linear side, so if you want something a bit more open, this is probably gonna turn you off slightly. Sometimes I felt like the DLC stretched the levels a little bit and filled them with a lot of enemies just to pad time. And speaking of enemies, if you play on legendary difficulty, which is said to be the original one, you're gonna get two-shot by even the basic mobs. And it didn't even feel this bad in the base game, but them tweaking around the difficulty settings probably made some of the enemies a bit unbalanced. But yeah, the levels were just kind of boring. But hey, if you don't care for super linear levels, then this might be for you. Now let's move on to the bosses. Look, I know you guys love Souls and Souls-like, so bosses are definitely something that you're most likely looking forward to, and I can definitely say that both Overture and Nightreign did a pretty decent job at this. Kind of. In Nightreign there are two types of bosses, the ones in the overworld and the Night Lords. The overworld bosses are reused from Elden Ring with one or two new attacks. You got guys like Godskin Duo, Falling Star Beast, Royal Revenants, the piece of shit annoying ones. You also got enemies with boss health bars as well. And you also got some Dark Souls bosses returning, like the Nameless King and Dancer of the Boreal Valley. But there aren't too many of those. The quality of the overworld bosses ranges from somewhat fun to straight up annoying. These were very hit or miss, especially on solo, but the bosses that really stood out in the game were the Night Lords. These are the bosses of the game. The quality of these guys are really great. Sure, you got one or two can just be straight up annoying, or have a few moves that suck to deal with, but they were really fun to fight, especially on multiplayer. On solo they can be really challenging, especially the final Night Lord, but again some of these guys, especially the final one, rivals or dare I say even surpass some of the other Souls games bosses in terms of quality and spectacle, which is something that really surprised me. Now in Lies of P Overture, the bosses were just fine, like they did their job. There were only like two that I really enjoyed fighting, but I felt like there could have been more. These two bosses were Marchiona, who's the second boss, so that's not really a spoiler or anything, and the final one, which I won't go too deep into, because again, spoilers. But I felt like the bosses were hit and miss for the most part. But again, the two that I mentioned were really good enough to carry the DLC. Plus, obviously, there's some other ones that are kind of cool as well, so you gotta take it with a grain of salt. This is just my personal interpretation of the bosses. You might enjoy the ones that I found mid. But if I'm gonna be honest, I think that Nightreign definitely takes the win in terms of bosses compared to Overture. No, obviously, if you add the main game as well, Lies of P is definitely gonna take the cake. But again, we're only focusing on the DLC for the video, and yeah, Nightreign's bosses were definitely better. But dare I say, the ones that were good in Lies of P Overture were definitely better than most of the Nightreign ones. It's kind of a weird thing to say, especially after like glazing Nightreign's bosses like that, but you just gotta understand. Also, the fact that you can refight them in a special mode is pretty cool. Now let's move on to story, and no, I won't spoil anything major, or anything at all to be honest, so don't worry. But I'm not gonna lie to you, I did not know what the hell was going on in both of these games. But at least with Overture I did have a clue. With Nightreign it's really hard to tell. However, what I did like is the fact that each of the Nightfarers have special missions, with the final one ending in a cutscene. This is great as it adds to their character and makes them feel like actual people. Now when it comes down to the details, again I don't know. Now Lies of P Overture's DLC takes you back in time before the puppet frenzy even happened. So yeah, the DLC is like a prequel but kind of a sequel at the same time. Basically you're trying to meet up with the legendary stalker and prevent some actions that occurred in the base game from happening. You also encounter some new faces along the way. Without spoiling too much, I like what the DLC did, especially for the final boss. So here's the thing, it might seem that I gave Nightreign a disservice by not going deeper with the story, but apart from knowing the character's story and seeing their cutscenes, you have to dig deep into the lore to understand what the fuck is going on. Very similar to your typical Souls game experience. There's no in-your-face storytelling in Nightreign due to how the game is set up. Even Elden Ring had a slightly more direct story. Now, Overture on the other hand is a bit more straightforward. Personally, I did prefer Overture's story since again it's single player, so story is obviously going to be the main focus. Finally, let's talk about replay value. This is kinda hard because on one hand, Nightreign can be played with friends, and there are times where even after beating the game, I was like, you know what, let me hop on Nightreign real quick. Because again, the gameplay is super fun, it's quick, fast paced, and again, it's just great to play with friends. But it can get a bit repetitive after a while since it's literally the same gameplay loop over and over again. I also wish they added a mode to refight the bosses again after defeating them, because I don't always want to do a whole 30-minute run back just to fight them again. Now what about Overture? Well, I'm not gonna lie, the levels didn't really stood out to me that much, especially after the second boss. It's your same old industrial plants, and apart from the very first two areas, they didn't really stand out too much, especially compared to the base game. So what about the bosses? There's some new bosses, but again, only two really stood out to me. But hey, for you it might be different, because everyone got different taste. But I did like the inclusion of a boss rematch mode. This is genuinely great, and it seemed like every Souls-like now has an option for one of these. So why don't FromSoft implement any? I don't know, but I feel like they're missing out on the crowd of people that want to replay these games for the bosses. I swear, it's a main reason why I spend a lot of time in Sekiro. You thought I was beating the game over and over and over again just to fight Ishin? No, it was because of the boss refight mode. So Lies of P definitely gets a lot of points for including this option. There's even a challenge mode in this as well. But apart from that, which game do I think has the better replay value? Well, it's really hard to tell because here's the thing, my mind right now is saying Nightreign due to the multiplayer aspect and the overall fast gameplay factor, but if the game doesn't have a lot of updates to keep it alive, then maybe in the long run, Lies of P is gonna have a better replay value due to the boss rematch mode itself, and the fact that you can just play through the story again. So this one is a bit 50-50 in my opinion, as it depends if you're more of a multiplayer guy or a I gotta challenge all the bosses type of guy. Nightreign is a very interesting game. Some people say that it seems more like an Elden Ring mod or a DLC, and while I do kind of agree on the DLC part, I do think calling it a glorified mod feels like a disservice, because Nightreign has a lot of good things going for it. The combat, despite being similar to Elden Ring, adds a more polished, faster paced edge to it. The Night Lord bosses are spectacles to behold, and they're super polished and well presented. Some even stand out among the best Souls bosses ever made. Even the worst one still has great things going on for them. But unfortunately, Nightreign can definitely feel a bit empty at times, especially after beating the final Night Lord. The game just doesn't have that much content within it. Sure, you have the remembrances for each character that gives you cutscenes and special dialogue / lore, but those aren't enough to keep most people playing, unless they keep adding content down the road. But let's say you don't care about any of that shit, and you're just mostly focused on getting through the main missions and calling it a day after defeating all the main bosses, then that's perfectly fine. Now with Lies of P Overture, there's a lot of people saying that they felt like the DLC wasn't worth $30, even though they enjoyed it, since it's around only 10 hours long, and I kind of agree to some extent. I do wish the DLC was longer, and if you compared it to like Shadow of the Erdtree for example, which was only $10 more, That expansion was filled with so much content, they even changed how the leveling system worked. It had a crazy amount of bosses and it just felt complete. I think Overture should have been $20 since that's the price of the old Hunters, and they're pretty much the same length. Shit, even the Ring City plus Ashes of Ariandel DLC costed only around $25 combined, and that's with the season pass. Each of them costing around $15 on their own. And they give you the same, dare I say, even more content than what Overture had to offer. Now again, this does not mean the DLC was bad or anything. Again, it was really good. I just felt like it could have been, a bit longer. For the most part, Overture was great. It added what I wanted, some cool new bosses, weapons, and most importantly, more Lies of P. It's still great, and hey, it's not like it's 4 hours long. 10 to 12 hours is still a pretty long time, especially if you're playing on, Legendary Stalker. And that's a decent amount of time for a game, especially a DLC. But at the end of the day, which one should you get? Well, if you prefer an expansion that adds on to the story and world while also giving you some cool new weapons, bosses to face, and some new features, I would say definitely go for Overture, especially if you only care about single player stories. But if you want a more multiplayer focused game that's super fast paced, enjoyable with friends or even randoms, but also plays like your typical RPG, where you have classes with different specialties and skills and great bosses to face, then I would say maybe go with Nightreign, especially if you already have a friend who likes Souls games.